They came from a country where to own the land of their birth and the food it produced was denied them. A nation devastated by centuries of oppression, leaving only one export, its sons and daughters. They arrived in America with little more than their strength and determination. They were described as the scattered. They came from a country where to own the land of their birth and the food it produced. They came from a country where to own the land of their birth and the food it produced was denied them. A nation devastated by centuries of oppression, leaving only one export, its sons and daughters. They arrived in America with little more than their strength and determination. They were described as the scattered debris of the Irish nation. Yet upon that debris, sweat and sacrifice, a new nation was built and a new identity. They said the Irish could never be loyal Americans, yet 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor list Ireland as their birthplace. They went from being marginalized to becoming voices of advocacy. They have gone from no Irish need apply to contributing in every field of endeavor. They are visionaries who transform the American dream into reality, blazing a path for others to follow. They are Irish Americans, and their story is our story. March is Irish American Heritage Month.
Thank you, Chris Cook, for that video at the beginning of our event today, produced by Neil Cosgrove, our Irish American Heritage Month chairman. Welcome to our second of 4 Irish American Heritage Month webinars. Tonight's is The Language Written in Their Hills, Language Revival and National Rebirth in the 20th Century Ireland. Our National History Chair is Daniel Taylor. Dan?
Thank you, Danny, and welcome everyone, as Danny said, to this, the second of our webinars for 2023 for Irish American Heritage Month. And if you would consider, if you looked at the family tree, if it were of European languages, you would see that there's a straight line that goes back thousands of years for the Celtic branch. Not too many cousins, if you will, in that family tree. And in fact, it was so for centuries, for most of recorded history, that the Irish language, which was indigenous to Ireland, was the dominant language of the Irish people. And in fact, the Irish people exported that language, most notably over to Scotland. And with the Norman invasion, however, came Old English and Norman French, and yet the Irish language held its own, with the earliest invaders becoming, as they said, more Irish than the Irish. The Statute of Kilkenny in 1367 made it illegal for the English to speak Irish and for the native Irish to speak that language when interacting with the English. Subsequent statutes forbade the use of the Irish language in the Irish Parliament, and later the Irish language was banned from courts of law. Up into 1831, we find that the British introduced a national school system for Ireland. And one of the textbooks widely in use was the Third Book of Lessons, dating from 1836, which contained a verse that Irish students were infamously required to recite. The verse goes as follows: I thank the goodness and the grace that on my birth have smiled and made me in these Christian days a happy English child. The British National Schools of Ireland certainly had no interest in teaching the Irish language to their happy English pupils. And yet, still the language survived, mostly in the far reaches of the west of Ireland, the poorest, most remote parts of the country. Think of County Kerry, Galway, Mayo, and Donegal. And sadly, when we look at the unfathomable loss of life in the Great Hunger, the Irish-speaking regions were hardest hit. The Irish language continued thereafter to be marginalized in British-controlled Ireland. Irish speakers were considered to be ignorant and unintelligent. But the fact is that Ireland has the oldest vernacular literature in Western Europe. Indeed, the English poet Edmund Spenser, who we cannot consider to have been a friend of the Irish in any respect, writing in the 16th century, admitted that, for where you say the Irish have always been without letters, you are therein much deceived, for it is certain that Ireland hath had the use of letters very anciently and long before England. As it happened in the latter decades of the 19th century, there was in Ireland an awakening. As the Irish question roiled successive British parliaments, the Irish people began to realize that they were not, in fact, happy English children, but rather were the heirs to a great and ancient Irish nation. A nation, as we will hear from our guest tonight, with a language of its own. We have with us tonight Professor Aidan Beatty, who is a visiting professor at the University of Pittsburgh Honors College, and he's going to talk to us tonight about the revival of the Irish language and national rebirth in 20th century Ireland. Professor Beatty was born in Galway, attended Trinity College, where he took a BA in history and political science with first-class honors. He then continued his education here in the United States at the University of Chicago, where he earned an MA and Ph.D., with his dissertation earning the 2014 Dalsimer Prize for Distinguished Dissertations from the American Conference for Irish Studies. As I said, Professor Beatty currently serves Pittsburgh Honors College, where his areas of interest include modern Ireland, the British Empire, and nationalism. Professor Beatty, take it away.
Thanks so much, and thanks for this great chance to just talk to you about some of my research. I'm going to start with a short piece of music, and it's a piece of music that many of you might already know. It's one of the most famous pieces of music in the whole canon of Irish music, and probably the most famous piece of Irish language music. This is about 2 minutes long, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I chose to start with this.
She the van bwylid war the be or grachw the ingidan Gwyl I bros I shelf merlo studio til leisn Galway or o shidava ho alla or o shidava ho alla or o shidava ho alla in she hakken taure ta graine will like a jiller sala ogli are melip margarda gweliad hims ni frank not spine is kudish yedruager galli or o shidava ho alla or o shidava ho alla or o shidava ho alla in she hakken taure so win led yet nevart gewekin mar mein don jaar schachten groin wils na milche gaiski see the fogert farmer galli or o shidava ho alla dar la moon I kid bo wanya or o shidava ho alla in she hakken taure.
So some of you might know that song. It's called Oro She Davaha Walya, or Hurrah, You Are Welcome Home. The welcome home of the title is a reference to the return of sovereignty or rule of some kind to Ireland. The lyrics of this version date to 1912, and here sovereignty or self-rule is personified by the character of Grania Whale, or Grace O'Malley, who was a real historic figure. She's sometimes called the Pirate Queen. She lived in the 16th century, but by the 20th century, she had become a kind of a symbol for the Irish nation itself. But Oro She Davaha Walya is a much older song, originally dating to the period after 1688. And in the earliest versions of the song, the sovereign who is returning to Ireland is not some kind of abstract symbol that represents the nation, but is a much more explicit figure. In the original version of the song, the sovereign returning is quite clearly named as Richeamus, King James, or his son Jarlas, Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, both members of the House of Stuart. In other words, the earliest version of the song depicts the return of the Catholic rule of the Scottish House of Stuart over Ireland, and it welcomes that return quite clearly. So in the earliest versions of this song, ethnicity or national self-determination are not really concerns. So when we look at the shift from the 18th century from the 18th century version of the song into the 20th century, what we can see is the shift from a strongly religious understanding of Irish politics and Irish identity to a much more nationalist one. The lyrics for this revised version of Oro She da Vaha Walia were written by this man here, Patrick Pearse. And as with the song, I'm assuming that he's a person that most of you are familiar with. He was a journalist, a language activist with a group called the Gaelic League, and an educator. And then in his most famous act, he was the self-declared first president of the Irish Republic, with his tenure as president lasting from Easter Monday 1916 until the following Monday when he surrendered to British forces. On the right in the image here, you can actually see the photo, a quite famous photo of him surrendering. And then in the original, you can see the original photos next to it. As you can see, standing behind Pearse is a woman. Her name was Elizabeth O'Farrell. She was a nurse, but she's literally photoshopped out of the most famous version of the photo. It's a bit too on the nose, but women were often literally airbrushed out of the narratives of Irish nationalist history. So I want to talk about Patrick Pearse today, and I want to talk a lot about the Gaelic League also. Pearse has become a somewhat maligned figure in Irish history, partly because of the way that later writers have often tended to describe him as an extremist or as a generally odd figure. And I think this is quite unfair. He's a more thoughtful figure than accounts like this often allow. His school, St. Enda's in Rathfarnham in South Dublin, was probably at its time the best school in Dublin, offering bilingual nationalist education and drawing on the progressive educational theories of Maria Montessori. And I'm going to really get into the topic of my talk by talking about Pearse and about St. Enda's. There's one specific incident in the history of this school that I want to start with, partly because it's an incident that exemplifies really well how Pearse and how a lot of other people within the Gaelic League conceptualized the Irish language, or what they thought the Irish language was doing for Ireland, and partly because it's an incident that fits very neatly with the broader theme of Irish American heritage. St. Enda's was a perennially cash-strapped school. Pearse was many things, but a good businessman was not one of them. And in 1914, when the finances of his school had come to a real crisis, Pearse did what Irish nationalists often do when they need a new influx of cash. He came to America on a fundraising tour. The trip was partly organized through a group called the Irish Republican Brotherhood that Pearse had just joined, and his involvement with which would lead 2 years later to his execution. And in an open letter to the boys of St. Enda's that he sent from the United States, Pearse said he hoped his pupils had all been working hard since returning from their Easter holidays. He reassured them that he'd been telling American audiences what fine fellows you are, and he let them know that upon his return, he would regale them all with exciting tales of what he called the sea sharks and land sharks that he encountered on his voyages. So in other words, he made the kinds of statements and observations that you would expect from a radical liberal Edwardian educator, which in many ways is what he was. But then at the end of his letter, Pearse made a seemingly more unusual announcement to his students. Remember, he said, that rifle, that gun, is still unwon. I want to give it away this summer, but it can only be given on condition that some boy wins it by a genuine effort to speak Irish. It's partly because of this kind of support for youthful violence, evident in both his writings and in his politics, that Pearse has not always received the warmest of appraisals from Irish historians in more recent years. Well, what I want to do is to construct a quite different appraisal of Patrick Pearse, and of Irish nationalism and of the Irish language movement in general. And it's an appraisal that takes the symbolism inherent in Pearse's letter as its starting point. The gift of a rifle to the best student of Irish at St. Enda's points to a deeper and much more complex issue in contemporary Irish nationalism. The notion that Irish men had been emasculated by the slow process of Anglicization. By no longer speaking Irish in the views of people like Pearse, they were alienated from their true national spirit, They were deficient and deformed, and as such, they were perhaps no longer even real men. The movement to revive the Irish language was therefore imagined as a process of reasserting a purified power, and often a very purified male power, and was often associated with a recovery of sovereignty and strength. Pearse's gift of a rifle had a clear layer of this kind of symbolic male power. Only when a boy had proved his mastery of his true native tongue would he be ready to wield this weapon. And that's because for Pearse, both the language and the gun were symbols of a resurgent and much more masculine Irish nation. When Daniel was introducing my talk, he mentioned the British educational system, and that was an educational system that Pearse did not have very fond views of. His famous 1913 essay, The Murder Machine, is where he really catalogued a lot of what he felt was wrong with the British educational system. And a lot of those concerns that I was just talking about reasserting male power, and also maybe an anxiety that male power has been lost, they really bubble up to the surface in this famous essay. The essay is an extended discussion of the British educational system, and that's the eponymous machine that he's talking about. And in this essay, Patrick Pearse says that the British educational system is worse than what he called an edict for the general castration of Irish males. So he's quite overt and explicit as to what he thinks is being done to Irish boys. Where education should inspire and harden, Pearse alleged that British state schools instead work to tame and enervate, and those are his words, to tame and enervate Irish boys. The result, therefore, is that Irish boys grow up to be Irish men who are not slaves merely, but eunuchs. So the kind of sexual language continues. And he also argued in a possible hint at the physical act of castration that the current educational system was akin to chopping off parts of children's bodies. A year later, in 1914, in a speech delivered in Philadelphia during his tour of the US, Pearse again talked of how an anglicizing education was, he said, emasculating our boys and corrupting our girls. He saw this as clear evidence of an English government conspiracy to enslave Ireland and cut off future generations from a proud history. Irish schoolboys, he said, were not taught to be brave, to be strong, to be truthful, to be self-reliant, and to be proud. But Pearse had a very clear plan for halting this loss of male power and this, what he quite frankly called national castration of Irish boyhood. A new education system, he said, has to do more than restore a national culture. It has to restore manhood to a race that has been deprived of it. Along with its inspiration, it must bring a certain hardening, he wrote in The Murder Machine. It must lead Ireland back to her sagas, to like Irish language myths and legends. Within a system that he felt would be based on fosterage, the supposed educational system of ancient Ireland, boys would be encouraged to recreate and perpetuate the traditions of legendary Irish heroes. And this program, of course, will be carried out not through English, but through the Irish language as an integral part of bringing Irish boys back into contact with the language and with their true heritage. And this was to be the prevailing ethos at St. Enda's College. And Pearse was by no means the first Irish language activist or first nationalist to draw out these connections between language and power and masculinity. His arguments about national castration echoed the views of the young Irelander Thomas Davis, who said, quote, "To impose another language on such a people is to send their history adrift amongst the accidents of translation. 'Tis to cut off the entail of feeling and separate the people from their forefathers by a deep gulf. It is to corrupt their very organs. The language of a nation's youth," Davis said, "is the only easy and full speech for its manhood and for its age." This desire for revival, coupled with the perpetual fear that the language will soon disappear, have long been features of Irish language discourse, and they're probably recurring tropes in the history of any language that remains in a perpetual minority status. And certainly the ideas of national decay, but via the Irish language, national revival, were already implicit in the ideology of the Gaelic Union, a precursor to the Gaelic League. The Union's membership card, for instance, as you can see here, depicted Ireland as a dark and decrepit land, broken with lots of broken down, aging architecture, but also then depicting the possibility of linguistic rejuvenation with the familiar Irish nationalist symbol of a distant rising sun. So presumably these were the ideas that a Gaelic Union member should carry close to his or her body along with their membership card. The inaugural issue of the Gaelic Union's magazine, Iarúsleabhar na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic Journal, featured a poem with the pleading title Go Mairich na Gael, May the Gaels Live. The poem insists that Anish tá na Gael in Éireann bio, and tá Gael agus Gaelic in Éireann fós. Now the Gaels are alive in Ireland, and the Gaels in the Irish language are in Ireland yet. But there's also an anxiety that runs through this poem about racial and linguistic decline. The declaration in the poem that Ní fear gwil an cheer no an changa dol fio, Ní fear gwil or manman cahaga fol. It's not true that the language or that the land or the language are in decline. It is not true that our spirit is quietly spent. That line signposts a reluctant recognition that things are not as they should be, highlighting how easily these fears could take on kind of gendered overtones. In an 1889 letter to the moderately nationalist Freeman's Journal, it was claimed that if the Gaelic Union and the more antiquarian-oriented Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language were not successful, as the letter said, we will be absorbed by our stronger sister, and Ireland soon will be West Britain. But a lot of the gendered components of these anxieties only became fully apparent with the founding of the Gaelic League in 1893. As a contributor to the League's Fáinne an Lé, or The Dawning of the Day, one of their two newspapers, asserted in 1898, Irish is a language which, on account of its almost unchanging character, enables us who use it now to think the thoughts and feel the feelings and live, as it were, in the same time with our forefathers who trod the earth and breathed the air of this country 20, 30 centuries back. An 1899 speech reprinted in the Gaelic League's other newspaper that you can see here on Clive Sullish, The Sword of Light, similarly presented the language not only as a means of communing with forefathers, right, with the nation's male ancestry, and communing with the nation's romanticized spaces, but also as a link to Ireland's mythical past. Without this link, and Clive Sullish said, the Irish would be a deficient people, lacking an important element of their heritage. As the speech in Clive Sullish said, for every Irishman, the ancient tongue had untold interest. It was the language written in their hills, their glens, and in the romances of their country. It summoned back the soul of olden times, the echo of silent hearts, the golden chain that bound with the past. The customs, beliefs, and dreams of their forefathers were embalmed in it. It preserved undying the image of Ireland clothed in the ancient Druid romances. And hence the extinction of such a language, Clive Sullish said, would be to the Irish nation an irretrievable loss, a gap in the continuity of their national being, the cutting off of their intellectual life, the cutting off of their religious life, their sacred traditions and romances, and their martyrs' struggles. As maybe is apparent by now, I firmly think that this language about cutting off strongly echoes Pearce's metaphorical view of what Anglicization was doing. In 1900, Reverend Michael O'Hickey, a prominent clerical supporter of the Gaelic League and a professor of Irish at St. Patrick's College in Maynooth, condemned the low level of the Irish language in the primary educational system, in like the grade school educational system. Are the Irish people going to endure this? He rhetorically asked in a pamphlet published by the Gaelic League. If so, he said, they deserve the worst that has ever been said about them. They are a people without spirit, without national self-respect, without racial pride, a poor, fibreless, degenerate, emasculated, effete race, he concluded, eminently deserving of the contempt of mankind. One of O'Hickey's students at Maynooth, Patrick Ford, showed his teacher's influence when he claimed that, speaking only English, we can never be perfect men, full and strong men, able to do a true man's part for God and fatherland. And then in very exaggerated prose, Ford went on to describe the Irish language as being again a means of reconnecting with a historic Irish masculinity. I don't ask you to go hunting after tidbits of curious information, he said, to become dry antiquarians, to peep and botanize upon the grave of Mother Erin. Look to your forefathers, read of them, speak of them, not in unworthy mendicant eloquence, nor yet in vulgar boasting about our ancient glories while we squat down in disgraceful content with our present degeneracy, nor least of all in miserable petty controversy with the hireling liars who calumniate our dear Ireland. No, Ford said, but to learn from them what you ought to be, what God destined Irish men to be. If an Irishman could only be perfected by speaking the language of his forefathers, without this language he would be, as another Gaelic League pamphlet phrased it, a self-degraded and denationalized being who is proud of being mean and who glories in being abject. But once such an abject young Irishman learnt Irish, a language of which he was previously ashamed, he would gain pride and self-respect from the knowledge that, the same pamphlet said, his Celtic ancestors were worthy of the vigorous and refined language they spoke. He would learn that Ireland has produced sages who in wisdom and learning were not surpassed by men of any nation in the world, and warriors who in valour might vie with the proudest of other lands. So again and again in Gaelic League publications and pamphlets and newspapers, the return to Irish was described as a return to a more glorious and heroic sense of Irish identity, before the humiliation of being deprived of state power and linguistic purity by British colonial rule. Ireland in the 1890s and the 1900s, like the rest of contemporary Europe, displayed various anxieties, usually called fin de siècle anxieties, about decay, degeneration, and racial decline. Late 19th century social Darwinism, as it was called, prompted some serious questions from Irish nationalists and Irish language activists, playing into these fears of degeneracy, weakness, and an uncertain future for a racially and linguistically impure nation, or supposedly racially and linguistically impure. At the very heart of this were a set of anxieties about what's usually called beirlachas, or Hiberno-English. Beirlachas is a pejorative term in Irish that describes this very heavily anglicized Irish language. And often what swirled around beirlachas was the idea that a degenerated patois reflected a deeper racial degeneration in the Irish nation. The Gaelic League, with its imagined return to an idealized and linguistically pure past, functioned as a kind of defensive shield against these kinds of anxieties. The desire to project a stronger and more respectable image of Irish manhood was also part of an anti-colonialist and nationalist project to refute the idea, popular in the late 19th century, that the Irish were a racially inferior people incapable of self-rule. As the Notre Dame-based Irish language scholar Brina Cuncahour has said, there was a common contemporary perception that Ante Lauer Berla Awan Bafui Smacht Hasana a Via Waver. He who spoke only English was under an English mental control. So learning Irish was a way to throw off the indignity of colonial control and to disprove all of these negative stereotypes that were being propagated under British rule. And I do think that anxieties about the Irish people's racial status and ethnic status underpinned much of the ideology of the Gaelic League. Speaking in Belfast in late 1899, the League's president, and indeed the future president of the Irish state, Douglas Hyde, was cheered when he somewhat defensively asserted that, as he said, the Irish were not Negroes or Uitlanders, right, for vaguely foreign people. They were people with a past and had a great past behind them. Hyde would later say that the return to Irish was a return to what he called the country's pure Aryan language. And Hyde was certainly also worried by the racial implications of the impure beirlachas, or Hiberno-English, popularly spoken by most Irish people. If by ceasing to speak Irish, our peasantry could learn to appreciate Shakespeare and Milton, Hyde said, to study Wordsworth or Tennyson, then I would certainly say goodbye to the Irish language. But this is not the case, he said. They lay aside a language which for all ordinary purposes of everyday life is much more forcible than any with which I am acquainted, and they replace it by another which they learn badly and speak with an atrocious accent, interlarding it, he said, with barbarisms and vulgarity. For Douglas Hyde, as for most of the Gaelic League, the grammatically impure, the racially impure, and national degeneration were three subsets of a broader whole. And it often seems like Irish revivalists like Hyde or Pearse are implicitly accepting the various accusations that lay behind anti-Irish biases, that Irish people were a weak people, racially inferior, lazy, incapable of self-rule, incapable of self-control. But they then invert these stereotypes, and they invert them into accusations against the British rule that they now claim has caused this situation, has actually caused these stereotypes to be real. And we can see this process in a way in this very famous Gaelic League poster produced in 1913 and designed by a woman called Seska Senovich Trench. I'll have her name there for me. Seska Senovich Trench, or Sive Trinchuk, as she calls herself in Irish. I used this at the very start of my talk. It's an incredibly striking image. It's a promotional poster for the 1913 Seachtain na Gaeilge, or Irish Language Week. And it contrasts a healthy and sovereign Irish-speaking Ireland alongside an anglicised and thus denationalised land. So on the right, as you can see, is a craven and pathetic figure wrapped in a Union Jack, wrapped in a British flag. She's an utterly feminised Ireland. She's reduced to begging as all around her boatloads of immigrants leave what has now become no longer a true Ireland, but a mere West Britain. And indeed, the country itself has been mutilated and cut in half, with the western seaboard, home of the last Irish speakers, chopped off. Conversely, in the opposing image, Ireland is clad in heroic clothing and proudly displays a weapon as a symbol of martial strength. And indeed, the woman on the right has perhaps become a man, or a manly and more powerful woman at the very least, by virtue of his or her return to the Irish language. And just as a purified language makes the Irish nation whole, so the whole land is made whole here. This kind of national mutilation and the cutting off of Irish speakers has been reversed. Language revival has also undone the waves of emigration. The now linguistically stable figure of Éire, not West Britain, Éire, using the Irish language name for Ireland, holds back the ships of immigrants with ropes, which also suggest a kind of physical stability and rootedness. A purified Irish language is thus redeeming the space of Ireland and making it whole. So this is all very abstract and kind of something that only exists in artistic representations of the Irish nation, but there were practical ways then that a member of the Gaelic League could redeem themselves, and in so doing perhaps also redeem the Irish nation. One was to wear traditional Irish clothing, or at least to wear what people imagined traditional Irish clothing to be. And here you can see students or photos of various students at Pearse's school, St. Enda's, literally dressing themselves in the ancient clothing of Irish warriors. And practices like this extended well beyond St. Enda's school. This man, Shane Leslie, an aristocratic convert to both Catholicism and the Gaelic League, was one of the strongest advocates of men's wearing of traditional clothing. The Irish nation, Shane Leslie felt, faced a clear danger from what he called the monstrous fashions of Queen Anne and the Georgian period, and from servile imitators of those fashions in Ireland. With the movement to revive the Irish language, Shane Leslie hoped that what he called the manly vesture in which their fathers lived and died would also be revived. And he said the sooner the high ancestry of the Irish kilt is accepted, the better. Similarly, in 1900, one Gaelic leaguer went so far as to seek out Pearse's counsel as to what should be the ideal clothing for an Irishman. Pearse had recently viewed a collection of 16th century clothing at the National Museum in Dublin, but he said it had left him sadly unimpressed. One would at first sight take them for a rather clumsily made and ill-treated pair of modern gentlemen's drawers, he lamented in his letter. Wearing them, Pearse said, one would run the risk of leading the spectators to imagine that you had forgotten to don your trousers. A spectacle like that, Pearse feared, would undermine the dignity of a Gaelic League celebration, and so he said, I should much prefer to see you arrayed in a kilt, although it may be less authentic than in a pair of these drawers, as he called them. So for people like Pearse, it was not a question of actually wearing historically accurate clothing, but of the image that such clothing would project. If you adopt a costume, Pearse wrote, let it at all events have some elements of picturesqueness. Shane Leslie had similar ideas. He urged that the Oireachtas, the annual assembly of the Gaelic League, would be the ideal place for 20 or 30 young men to appear together in the kilt. And he said he believed that there were men all over Ireland just waiting for his lead to show them how to wear the kilt. You can actually see here a photograph of a Gaelic League Oireachtas held, I think in Galway in 1913. My Zoom thing is blocking me. Yeah, Galway in 1913. And as you can see here in the front row, there's a few men wearing kilts, and then most of the crowd here are wearing what would be traditional clothing, like conventional clothing, for the early 20th century. And then there is, I believe, one woman dressed also in some kind of imagined version of traditional Irish, like ancient Irish clothing. It was much more common for men than women to dress up like this, as you can see in this image. Douglas Hyde fully supported the wearing of clothing like this, also believing that the wearing of traditional Irish clothing would be a way to promote industry, particularly to promote things like tweed manufacture along the west coast of Ireland. As I said, it was way more common for men than women, though, to wear this kind of traditional clothing and to project an image of recovered Gaelic heroism by wearing this clothing. At the 1910 Oireachtas, the Republican magazine, feminist Republican magazine, Ban na Héireann, or the Woman of Ireland, or the Irish Woman, reported that there were 50 men who looked to great advantage in the old Irish dress, while only 20 women were similarly attired. And this was despite the fact that it was a rule of the Oireachtas that no prize would be awarded to any competitor who was not dressed in clothes of Irish material and manufacture. The clothing that you can see here on the front cover of Ban na Héireann is much more common for what a female Gaelic leaguer would have worn. More popular than this nationalist fancy dress, though, and representing an even more fundamental personal transformation, was the popular practice of changing your name. This was also linked to a desire for a kind of redeemed and purified Irish identity. It's the process whereby John Leslie, a landed nobleman, Oxford graduate, and the first cousin of Winston Churchill, became Shane Leslie, sometimes also spelling it, as you can see here, Sean Leslie, which is a very fanciful and pretty much made up Irish language spelling of the last name Leslie, which is not a name of Irish origin. Percy Frederick Beasley, the son of Irish immigrants in Liverpool, became Peirish Beasley, a member of the Gaelic League, a member of the Volunteers, a precursor to the IRA, a member of Sinn Féin who sided with the treaty side during the Irish Civil War, and then Michael Collins's first biographer. Patrick Pearse, the son of a Birmingham stonecutter, became Pádraig Mac Piarish, as well as adopting pen names that suggested some kind of recovered Gaelic ideal, names like Colm O'Conora and Cuivine O'Coulon. And as we see in many other ways, Pearse was picking up on ideas that were popular throughout the Irish language movement. In 1899, presenting evidence to a government inquiry into education, Douglas Hyde argued that the Irish nation had become ashamed of their Irish names. Hyde let it be known that he, and indeed the Gaelic League in general, believe that no good can result to national character from such a state of things as that shame at Irish names. Moreover, Hyde said, no wise government, unless it was deliberately playing the game to weaken the people, would have allowed such a tone of mind as that to have arisen. 4 years later, in 1903, in an attempt to have mail addressed in Irish accepted, Hyde sent a volume to the post office giving the correct forms of Irish names, which are now being widely adopted, and what he called the vulgarized and corrupt forms, which are also in vogue. The vulgarized and corrupt forms are the English versions of people's names. The correct forms, of course, are the Irish names. That same year, in 1903, a woman named Nellie Nivrian, or Nellie O'Brien, a leading figure in the Gaelic League's Dublin-based Crave na Cuigi, the branch of the 5 provinces, spoke with pride about what she called the good old Irish names of her 3 sons, Donogh, Pádraig, and Fionn. Like Douglas Hyde, Nellie Nivrian, Nellie O'Brien, was a Protestant, as were a disproportionate number of her branch of the Gaelic League. And it would not be a stretch to imagine that this very, very Irish practice served to reaffirm their contested sense of national identity. And indeed, Douglas Hyde would regularly claim that the Reverend R.R. Kane, a staunchly unionist Protestant cleric from Belfast, had once confessed to him that he could never forget that his real name was O'Kyan, not Kane. Name changing was also a complex practice capable of expressing a number of quite different ideals. Douglas Hyde, for instance, adopted the pen name An Craveen Avon, the pleasant little tree branch, which points to a far less forceful, far less aggressive vision of a de-Anglicized Irish scholarly identity. And it was not only Protestants or those with an English ancestry, both of whom were at risk of being placed outside the boundaries of the nation, who engaged in this practice. Patrick Inglesby, one of the main organisers of the Gaelic League's annual language parades in Dublin, became Pádraig Mac Gilla Isa, literally meaning Patrick, son of the servant of Jesus. And nor was it only men who changed their names. Agnes Farrelly, a feminist educator and one of the few leading female figures of the early Gaelic League, decided after her first visit to the Irish-speaking Aran Islands that she would now rather be known as Una Ní Haralig instead of her birth name, Agnes Mary Winifred Farrelly. This idea that a link exists between a lost language and some kind of national deficiency has had a long half-life in Ireland. At the 1932 Sinn Féin Ardèche, the annual meeting of Sinn Féin, the then head of the party, Brian O'Higgins, or Brian O'Higgin, as he also liked to be called, delivered a tirade about the English government, which he said displayed Kiel and Dial Féin, the reasoning of the devil himself, in their diabolical schemes to destroy Irish national identity. Such schemes, he claimed, had led to the situation whereby Ní corpa bháin atá éire ceangalta le galamh ach í naigna agus í món comha. It is not only in the body that Ireland is connected to the foreigner, and foreigner in Irish almost always means English people, but also in consciousness and in mind. And then he continued his theme, albeit now in apologetic English. And now I must speak to you, he said, in this other tongue that is a living and constant reproach to us, a constant reminder that we are an enslaved nation, that we are bound body and mind to our one and only enemy in the whole world, and that to be free, we must come back to the truth, build up from the foundations again, and make ourselves fit for freedom when it comes. By 1932, when Brian O'Higgin wrote these lines and recited them as a speech, Sinn Féin had become little more than a fringe element in Irish politics. But their leader was expressing a common notion about the ways in which national sovereignty and a purified Irish language intersect or bound up with each other. Similar symbols and rhetoric appear in the publications of Glún na Buatha, The Victorious Generation, and the more fascist-oriented Altri na Hasheri, Architects of the Resurrection, two important, if short-lived, post-1922 Irish language groups. As late as 1967, the journalist Peter Lennon was still able to observe that for more than 30 years we've been led to believe that the magic potion, which Lennon said was to restore dignity, identity, and confidence to a mutilated republic, was the revival of our ancient tongue. And if you walk around any major town or city in Ireland today, you'll still find this phrase, Tír changa, Tír anam. A land without a language is a land without a soul, posted up on stickers on lampposts or written in graffiti in various parts of the country. And often then connecting that sentiment, that linguistic sentiment, to some other political concern, in this case, socialist republicanism. But perhaps this kind of focus on the language as a symbol of recovered Gaelic ideals and the continuing attempts to control Irish-speaking rural areas explains one of the most obvious paradoxes in the history of Irish nationalism. Irish nationalists clearly displayed a strong anxiety about what it meant to live in an Anglicized country, what it meant to have the Irish language go into decline. And yet, since 1922, the Irish state has proved singularly incapable of reviving the language. And given how interventionist that state could be in other areas, whether it was citizens' sex lives, their choice of reading material, even their leisure habits, that failure is perplexing and I think requires explanation. A focus on the Irish language as a living thing, as something capable of change and capable of borrowing from other languages, which is what a living, breathing language does. Focusing on the Irish language as that would perhaps have defied the purpose of its revival and purification in the first place. Perhaps the purpose for people like Patrick Pearse was always to engage in the act of symbolic defiance, which relearning Irish necessitated, rather than recreating the language as just another run-of-the-mill vernacular. The ongoing and never completed process of learning Irish acts as a clear symbol of the harm done by colonial rule and of the need for government action to rectify this. It's often questionable how committed all Irish nationalists were to reviving Irish as opposed to just using it as a means of reconnecting to a pure and nostalgic and harmonious pre-Anglicization Irish past. And so for a lot of Irish nationalists, the Irish language remained something to be appreciated for its symbolic content rather than a real living, breathing language. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very interesting. I wonder, if we look back at many other national sovereignty movements, the idea that there's a language associated with the nation in question is not unique to Ireland. It's probably a common denominator in most such movements. Do you think the fact that English, is the language of international commerce, and as the British Empire was fading, the United States was on the rise, as the prevalence of English as an international language of trade and the connections between Ireland and America, has that been a factor in the fact that the people in Ireland still predominantly speak English?
I think absolutely. I think it's very difficult it would be very difficult to do international trade through the Irish language. And if you look at, the Irish language activists do talk a lot about other languages. Pearse, for instance, is very, very interested in Belgium as an example of a bilingual nation. And he goes there and studies their schools. But even just the fact that the two languages in question in Belgium are Dutch and French, which still allow you to trade with the Netherlands, with France, with Canada, with the Francophone world. Like, you're not as cut off if you're speaking those languages. I think a lot of this does just kind of crash against economic realities, and also there's the fact that migration is part of this too. It's quite difficult to emigrate to the United States if you only speak Irish. You're going to have a long process of assimilation then, whereas if you step off a boat in Ellis Island as a fully fluent English speaker, things are hopefully going to be a lot easier for you. So I do think a lot of that just basic reality is a big explanation of this too, for sure.
Our organization, the AOH, in I think 1896, endowed an Irish language chair at Catholic University, and I think it was 1904. W.B. Yeats was there speaking and said he looked forward to the day when Irish was spoken in Ireland to the exclusion of all other languages. And you have to look back and just think that maybe that was an unrealistic aspiration. It's part of the fervor of the nationalist movement, But when the reality of, again, running a country and an economy in the 20th century comes to bear, you have to yield to realities.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting thing that happens with a lot of these people that I'm talking about. By the 20s, they become very depressed because they look around and think, well, is this it? This is what we, devoted all our time to building for decades. It's just a regular country. And they realize like national sovereignty is not this panacea that's going to solve all problems. Now you're a small European nation. You exist kind of buffeted around by big powers still. And those powers can exert influence on you in ways that you can't control.
I think many of us who have made efforts over the years to learn some Irish have found that it is very much different from English. It's a difficult language to learn, particularly as an adult. Now, you came up in Ireland. It's almost a stereotype now. It's a cliche, the jokes about Irish students and the leaving cert and having to pass the Irish language portion of that. Why don't you tell us your experience with that and how students today regard the requirement of Irish language instruction in school?
So there are quite a lot of like Irish medium schools, and it's a language that does have a certain kind of cultural cachet, I think. So a lot of very like upwardly mobile families will have their children go to those kinds of schools. I had the kind of standard Irish education that from the age of 4 or 5 or whatever it was, I was learning Irish until I was 18. I would not have been in any way fluent when I left, but I had a very strong reading ability of Irish. And then the first 2 years that I was in university, I did take like extra classes in Irish, in spoken Irish. The point where I actually became like, I wouldn't claim in any way that I'm fluent in Irish, but I'm fairly literate in Irish in that like I can read old newspapers and things like that, but speaking it I wouldn't be able to do. Ironically, the place where I became as strong as I ever was in Irish was in Chicago, not in Ireland, when I had to learn it for my Ph.D. And also to pass the language exams that I needed to pass for grad school. I think people's attitudes towards Irish today are very mixed. There probably is a lot of defensiveness about Irish. I mean, people feel a sense of protectiveness about it, even quite young people, I think. Even if they don't speak it, even if they have no desire to speak it, they are quite happy. I think most Irish people are quite happy to see it protected. I'm sure there are some, a lot of Irish teenagers who get kind of frustrated and think like, I could be learning another continental European language rather than this. And I'll say one thing that is another very cliched thing about Irish people is Irish people are very happy to have that language when they're on continental Europe or when they're around British people and you have a secret language that you can speak that no one else can speak. And it can be very useful at moments like that.
All right, and Danny, do we have any questions from the audience?
I'm looking here. Anyone, if you raise your hand like, we got one. Hold on, give me a second here. Margaret, go ahead with your question.
So we travel a lot to Europe and Great Britain and more to Ireland than almost any place. And one thing we've noticed is that the Welsh children, as opposed to the Irish children, seem to be, as a country, more likely to be learning Welsh and speaking it wherever they happen to be. Can you address that at all and how you think Ireland compares to Wales and why the difference is?
So Ireland compares poorly to Wales. Welsh is, just in terms of like the percentage of Welsh people that can speak Welsh in real terms, it's much better than the percentage of Irish people who can speak Irish. I would say very, very broadly speaking, there are two reasons why that's the case. If we look at it at a kind of at the level of not just Wales and Ireland, but Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. Scots Gaelic, which is very closely related to Irish, is also a language that has been in decline for quite a while. The big difference between Welsh people versus Scottish people and Irish people is Welsh people never rebelled in the same way against British rule. And so there was never the same attempt to suppress indigenous culture in the same way. And you don't also get the same level of migration, right? There is a huge Scottish migration out of the Highlands in the 1830s. And migration is not even really the right word. It's forced displacement of moving Scottish people to Nova Scotia. And often the people that are being moved are the people descended from Jacobites who had risen and rebelled against British rule in the 18th century. So you actually find probably more, I mean, there's quite a lot of Scots Gaelic speakers now in Nova Scotia. I don't know offhand, are there more there than in Scotland itself, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were. You don't get a lot of migration out of Wales to the same degree. You can stay in Wales, right? They have coal mines, they have a much more thriving economy than Ireland, so you can stay and be a Welsh speaker in Wales. It's not that, like, you have to understand that with the decline of Irish, it's often caused by migration. It's caused by people going to places like the US or Canada or Australia and forgetting this language, or learning English in Ireland so as to be able to migrate, to be able to emigrate. And there are Welsh people who move to, there's a huge, noticeable Welsh migration to Argentina, but nothing like you would see in Ireland. So nothing like the loss of native speakers to the same degree. And there are sort of smarter things that Welsh culture has done. There's a really good music scene in Welsh. If you want to listen to Irish music in Irish, mostly that's traditional music, and that doesn't really attract young people. But weird psychedelic music and rock music in Welsh that has existed since the 70s and 80s, that does attract people. That does attract young people. And there were like Welsh language TV stations, a Welsh language TV station long before there was an Irish language TV station. Having said all that, you will find very similar stories from people who grew up in Welsh speaking areas where they were told, like, do not speak this language when you come to school, you are to speak English, being punished by their teachers for speaking Welsh, things like that. So I don't want to kind of romanticize Welsh either. It has faced its own struggles as a language.
Thank you.
Okay, Dan, that's the questions. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. And Professor, one last question, perhaps sort of a modern day current issue question. There's been some political back and forth in the north of Ireland about an Irish language bill. Mm-hmm. You care to comment on that and talk about what's going on there?
So a lot of it is not really, I mean, it's not really about the language itself. It's in some ways, to kind of go back to my talk, it's about what the language symbolizes and what kind of meanings people read into this language. So you will find people who come from the Republican movement in Northern Ireland, like people who would have been in Sinn Féin or the IRA, who spent time in prison in the 70s or 80s. They often learned Irish while in prison. They used Irish as a kind of basically like a secret language in prison so that they could talk without prison guards understanding them. You'll then find like stories of prison guards actually learning Irish so as to be able to surveil prisoners. So for a long, long time, it's a language that has been seen as a Republican language, right? As a very politicized language. And so from a unionist perspective, like from a Protestant perspective in Northern Ireland, the idea of ceding ground to that language is itself kind of symbolically problematic, because you don't want to cede ground. You're then ceding ground to republicanism, to Irish nationalism, effectively. And some of it is also, I think, the anxiety that a lot of unionists have that they're losing power and they're losing control of Northern Ireland. And now they're not so much in a state or a statelet where they're the dominant group and Republicans are a minority. They're now in a shared state where both communities have equal power, and maybe even in time it's going to, the kind of the seesaw, that, what do you call that in America, teeter-totter, is going to like tip the other way, right? That Republicans are going and Catholics are going to be the dominant group in Northern Ireland, and this kind of increasing state recognition of the Irish language is for them a symbol of that kind of slippery slope. So they've been quite hostile to that, kind of hostile out of all proportion to like the actual number of Irish speakers in Northern Ireland itself and things like that, because it's not really about the language, it's about politics. Again, you know, I would say there's a few things that complicate that. You do find Northern Irish Protestants who are learning Irish. There's a very famous case of a woman called Linda Irvine, who comes from a very, very well-known like loyalist family in Northern Ireland, like a Protestant pro-British family, and she's one of the most prominent Irish speakers in Northern Ireland now. And for her, it's about you know, this is part of her heritage too, right? She's not English, she's Northern Irish, and she has that a very complicated sense of her own identity, and the Irish language is a part of that identity. But she's something of an outlier, I would say, for and certainly for like the main political party on the loyalist side, the unionist side in Northern Ireland. They see the Irish language as an unwelcome incursion into their culture, into their community.
All right. Thank you, Professor. And if we have no other questions, I want to thank you for participating today. I do want to remind our audience that we have upcoming webinars on the 25th with Robert Collins talking about Irish America and the Troubles. And on the 29th, we have Professor David Wilson talking about the Fenian invasion of Canada and the Canadian secret police. So keep those in mind. Danny, any parting words for us?
Just thank you both. Aidan, that was a great talk. I'm sure we'll get a lot of use of it. One last question did pop up. He kind of addressed it, but Dan O'Connor was talking about how strong. I guess he's asking how strong are the current efforts to provide Irish language education, both in Ireland and here in the United States. And you talked about learning more in grad school as you were finishing up. If you touch on those two, and then I think Chris Cook is going to close this out.
So I think that if you were to ask someone in Ireland in their 50s or 60s, like, what was your experience of learning Irish? Almost certainly they will mention a book called Peg, which is a book that sort of they will and there's a good chance they will remember it with kind of terror about this like incredibly depressing book in Irish that they had to read in school, which is actually a somewhat unfair assessment of that book, because it's a better book than the kind of excerpts you were forced to read in school would suggest. But that old way of teaching Irish I think has gone out quite a bit, and it is taught much more as a spoken language. And now that you have like a TV station that broadcasts in Irish, you have a radio station that broadcasts in Irish. There are things like cafes and pubs and restaurants that like give preference to customers that will speak in Irish and things like that. So there's a good infrastructure for Irish speakers in Ireland. I won't even claim to know what the scene is like in terms of learning Irish in America, other than just knowing kind of random universities that happen to teach it, including the University of Pittsburgh, where I teach, which I was quite surprised by when I came here. I didn't know about that until I started here. So in terms of like endangered languages, it's in a very healthy state, because there's actually enough speakers and enough regular use of it to actually keep it surviving. It will almost certainly never be a majority language anywhere on the island of Ireland, but it is, I think, relatively doing well. But it is doing well by breaking with the way it was done in the past. I think that answers the questions I was asking.
Yeah, that does. And John McKinney had his hand up, and I missed him. Go ahead, John.
Yes, that's okay. I live here in North Carolina, and for the last 7 years, we've had Fulbright scholars from Ireland come over, and actually at a community college. So they teach us. I've been learning the language for 7 years, and like you, Professor, my conversational skills are pretty pathetic. but the grammar and the reading, I think, is interesting. I've always taken it for personal enrichment. Are you hopeful or encouraged? And I'm not sure if you're aware of how many. I think in the United States, there's more people learning Irish than there are actually in Ireland now, at least according to Duolingo and some of those. But some of the teachers we've had were from Ulster, some from Connacht. So there's a little bit of, Kana Smaratatu and Kaji Maratatu. We kind of get a little bit mixed up. But
Mm-hmm.
I've been to the Gaeltacht in Donegal up in Gweedore as well.
Mm-hmm.
But is there any feeling in Ireland about foreigners, so to speak, or people in the United States learning Irish? Are they looking at us and going, why are they doing that? I mean, I think there's a connection with our heritage that
Mm-hmm.
Irish Americans feel that I think many people in Ireland, at least the children, won't realize until later in life that they've lost that connection.
So I would suspect a lot of Irish people don't know about that, but I'm not totally sure. What I think you'll also find, and it's a very encouraging thing and a very like positive thing about the language and also about like for Irish society is, if you've been to Ireland a lot over maybe the last 30 years, you'll know that it went from being a very homogenous and kind of enclosed society that didn't really have a lot of incoming migrants to being a much more racially diverse society. And now you have people who were born in the 1990s or born in the early 2000s who are now in their 20s and have been completely through the Irish educational system, who are able to speak Irish, but whose heritage is to somewhere like Nigeria or Poland or Ukraine. The main Irish language channel, the only Irish language TV station, TG Cahir, has an absolutely amazing ability to find Irish speakers in every part of the world. So when there was American troops pulling out of Afghanistan, they had a person on the ground in Afghanistan that they found who was an Irish speaker who could do like a news report for them. They've done the same in Ukraine. And that's, I think, a very encouraging thing. So I would imagine if Irish people did know about, if they did kind of one day learn about Irish Americans learning Irish, they would see it as part of that, of like the sort of the diverse types of Irishness that exist around the world.
Well, thank you again, Professor. We appreciate it always. Glad to know you're just down the road. Next time I get to Pittsburgh, I'll maybe try and look you up. And Dan's right in your neighborhood as well. With that, we're going to turn things over to Chris Cook. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks. And just to interject also on two things that John mentioned. First, with the community colleges, you don't need to be a college student necessarily to take those courses. Look at your local colleges, see if they do offer a Gaelic course. You can always audit those. It doesn't cost a lot of money. The other one he mentioned as digital coordinator, I definitely have to promote this, is the Duolingo app. That is a language app. It's a great language app. And one of the languages that they do have on there is the Irish language. So if you don't have a college available or someone that you can learn directly from, that is an option for you. And lastly, I'll close this out with one of my favorite songs recently, Kin of Cuchulainn. So this is mostly in English and tells the story of Cuchulainn, but the last verse is a call for the National Irish Language Act. So the last closing phrase was a phrase used to promote the act in Northern Ireland. So it's Ach na Gaeilge Anish, Anish being now.
Lost days of youth when slow grew the tree, when Ulster was defended by conqueree, in the land of enchantment where swans freely flock, stands a young and brave man, Cuchulainn and Leoch. They called him Setanta when he was a boy. They heard of his deeds from Finland to Troy, and those great Trojan warriors all valley had fame. They cried for Cuchulainn as their city did flame. There is hurl and gay Bolga, or hell and Treef men. He met with the armies of Maeve and the Glen, where he set them lapping with a king and quake swing. He cut them and felled them like grass in spring. He once fought with Virgia, true childhood friend, wept by his side when his life did end. We carried his body to Old's great plain and buried him deep where flies o'er the cream. People of Ulster still fight in the fords in this land where the Gaeilgeoir is seen but not heard. For the tongue of Cuchulainn and Ferdia and Moore in the north of this island is quietly roared. But down through the ages with Dalsimer, skiff she did give us all for to hear. Who ken of Cuchulainn persist in your ways and shout to bright heaven, ach na Gaeilge and me.